Good morning. My name's Ruth. I'm one of the pastors here, and today we are continuing our series on Mark. We're going to be looking at chapters 7 and 8. I was thinking this week, whoever wrote Mark's gospel, and we don't know who it was, I think they would have just been blown away by the idea that 2,000 years later, millions of people would be reading these words that he wrote, all over the world in thousands of different languages. And not just reading it, but really dissecting it and looking at each word and what did it mean and why did he put certain stories in a certain order. I guess it's probably a good idea that he didn't know that was going to happen, because I would think that would have a bit of a paralyzing effect on you, wouldn't it? It was like, ooh, how do you write something that's going to come under that much scrutiny? But he did write. He wrote about 11,000 words. And over the last 2,000 years, countless tomes have been written on those 11,000 words. In just one commentary, for example, the Anchor Yale Bible commentary, its section on Mark has about 500,000 words. That's just one of so many different commentaries. And to get 500,000 words from 11,000 words, I think you're probably going to have to make some things up, right? You're going to have to throw in a bit of conjecture. With all due respect to the scholars, I'm sure it's a wonderful work, but there are some things we're going to have to guess. I think we probably sometimes read more into a Bible passage like the ones that we're going to be looking at today than maybe the author even intended. Having said that, as with almost any book, there is a structure to Mark, and he places his stories in a particular order, and it's not just chronological. And in fact, in some places, it's very clearly not chronological. And he's doing that to make a certain point. And our section today, chapters 7 and 8, seem to be one of those situations. They seem to be part of a larger section that intentionally repeats the same kinds of stories. And we need to look at those stories, I think, to be able to figure out what Mark is doing here. So I think on the next slide, we can see that. So in chapter 5, we have one of those Markan sandwiches that Wesley talked about a few weeks ago, a story inserted into the middle of another story. We have the story of Jairus, one of the leaders of the Jewish synagogue. He comes and he throws himself at Jesus' feet and begs Jesus to heal his 12-year-old daughter who is homesick. Before Jesus can get there, we get story number 2 thrown in there. A woman in the crowd who has been hemorrhaging for 12 years, so as long as this little girl has been alive, she comes and she touches Jesus' cloak and she's healed. And as a woman who's bleeding, she is ceremonially unclean. She should have been secluded at home. But now she has ritually defiled Jesus. She's made him unclean by touching him. And according to Jewish law, religious law, Jesus will now need to bathe. He'll need to wash his clothes and not come into contact with anybody until sunset. He doesn't seem bothered by any of that, of course. And he, returning to story 1, even though he's told at that point that the little girl has died, he continues to Jairus' house. He takes the dead girl by the hand, so he's touching a corpse. Again, that would make him incredibly unclean. And he raises her back to life. And then in then in chapter 6, we have him miraculously feeding 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves of bread and 2 small fish. And all of this takes place in in Jewish territory. As Matthew was talking about last week, this all happens in Galilee. This happens in Jewish territory. And then we come to today's section, which starts at chapter 7 with this question: who is clean? What does it mean to be clean? Who is acceptable to God? And continuing in chapter 7, as we'll see in a moment, we have a story that parallels those 2 stories that were sandwiched together. There we had Jesus healing a desperate, unclean Jewish woman and an unclean girl. She was unclean because she was dead. And in chapter 7, we have Jesus healing a desperate Gentile woman's daughter. She's unclean because she's a Gentile. She's non-Jewish. And then Jesus will miraculously feed 4,000 people with, again, small number of bread and fish. And this time it's all happening in Gentile territory. And both of these sections are initiated by Jesus calming a storm at sea, as we saw last week. In chapter 4, so before we start on this block, we have the story of Jesus sleeping in the boat, and the disciples wake him up and say, calm the storm, and he does. And then at the end of chapter 6, so just before we get to today's section, we have Jesus walking on the water, and during the storm, getting into the boat, and the storm dies down. So the setting for all of these stories is one of turbulence, confusion, danger even. And Jesus being in the midst of that as a source of calm and order. Jesus speaking and acting from a peaceful, grounded center, even in the midst of all this turmoil and emotional tension. So we're going to jump into the text today at this green, or it looks yellow there, yellow point in the middle of this discussion of what does it mean to be clean. This is quite a long discussion, and Andrew is going to come and read that to us.
The Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, "Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders, instead of eating their food with defiled hands?" He replied, "Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human traditions." And he continued, "You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' and anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is korban, that is, devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their father or mother. Thus you nullify the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many things like that." Again, Jesus called the crowd to him and said, "Listen to me, everyone, and understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going into them. Rather, it is what comes out of a person that defiles them." After he had left the crowd and entered the house, his disciples asked him about this parable. "Are you so dull?" he asked. "Don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach, and then out of the body." In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. He went on, "What comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person."
Andrew. So as you might remember, we believe that Mark, or the author of Mark, we'll just call him Mark for simplicity, is writing to a largely Gentile audience. And part of the reason we think that is because of passages like this, where he explains Jewish customs like ceremonial washing. Now, this, of course, is not about hygiene, right? For hygiene purposes, it is a very good idea to wash your hands before eating, especially back in those days when they didn't use utensils. And particularly if you were coming from the market where you might have been touching all kinds of things. But this is not about regular normal washing. It's about ceremonial washing. In Exodus 30, we read that Moses, the traditional giver of the law to the nation of Israel, had people make a bronze basin and put it outside the entrance to the tabernacle. Yeah, you can see a picture of it here. This is a replica, obviously. Shouldn't need to say that, but you never know. And I don't know if you can see, it's kind of small, but it's right there. So it's in between this box, which would have fire in it, and this is the tent of meeting, and there would be this bronze basin here. And the priests had to ceremonially wash their hands in this basin before they could make any offerings. And the practices that were laid out for the tabernacle, you remember, is what the Jewish people would worship in as they were moving around the wilderness. Those rules passed to the temple once the temple was built. So the priests in Jesus' time who served the temple in Jerusalem practiced the ceremonial washing. But around the year 160 BCE, a group called the Pharisees was established. And they were lay people, they weren't priests, but they were very religious. And their mission was to extend the religious laws into everyday life. And that included extending the laws about purity and cleanliness that ordinarily applied to the temple and making that apply to people's home life. And they seem to have been very effective at doing this. There's a lot of archaeological evidence that shows that from the 1st century BC onwards, people started building these, on the next slide, 7-stepped baths for ceremonial bathing. They're called mikveh. There's also evidence that they were switching from earthenware pots, which couldn't be made ceremonially clean, to stoneware, which was more expensive, but it could be made ceremonially clean. So it became unclean. You could wash it rather than just throwing it away. This is a photo. You might remember this from a series a couple of years ago now, actually, but this is from a stone vessel workshop that was excavated in Galilee, and it dates back to around the time of Jesus. And there are hundreds of stone vessels that have been found in Galilee, and none of them predate the 1st century BCE. So we think that this practice of everyone needing to be ceremonially clean, not just the priests serving the temple, was a relatively new Jewish religious idea that was championed by, and perhaps even enforced by, the Pharisees. And their particular focus, the Pharisees' particular focus, was on food. 2/3 of the Pharisees' regulations that have come down to us in written form relate to food, on how it's grown, how it's processed, who you can eat with and who you can't, what you can eat, what you can't, even what vessels need the food, certain foods need to be served in, and so on. The tradition of the elders, the Jewish oral tradition, said that rabbis needed to build a fence around the Torah, build a fence around the Jewish law. They needed to protect it by going beyond the requirements and extend it in order to guard it. And that's what the Pharisees thought that they were doing. They were extending the law to everyday life in order to ensure the holiness, the purity of the Jewish people. Now, that's not a bad intention, right? These external rituals were intended to remind people that there is no sacred and no secular. If you need to be pure in order to eat food in the temple, you should be pure to eat food in your home. These external rituals were intended to remind people of the need for internal devotion to God's law while they were engaged in their everyday life. The problem was, though, of course, that the external rituals became the be-all and end-all. You could actually ignore all the internal stuff as long as you carried out the external rituals. And Jesus quotes here Isaiah chapter 29 in responding to the Pharisees. He says, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. As it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You have let go of the commands of God and are holding on to human tradition. The Pharisees claimed to be applying God's law to everyday life, but by focusing only on the externals, they actually undermined God's law. And Jesus gives that example that God's law says, honor your father and mother. But Pharisees say that if you've promised to one day give your savings to the temple, you've pronounced them korban, in effect, you could say that they don't really belong to you anymore, and therefore you can't use them or don't need to use them to help your aging parents in their time of need. They created a loophole that makes you look really devout, right? You're given to the temple, but really they're just bypassing the requirements of God's law. Now, this discussion might sound very abstract to us. Probably we've not declared anything korban this week, probably. We're probably not too worried about whether our pots are ceremonially clean. I'm not. But this was anything but an abstract theological debate. This was an impassioned, head-on confrontation between Jesus and powerful men who claimed to speak for God and who reputedly upheld the purity and, in fact, the very identity of the Jewish nation. They policed the boundaries. They made sure that impurity out there in pagan society couldn't enter the community. They were nationalists. They were patriots. The most famous martyrs in Jewish history died because they refused to become ceremonially unclean, usually by eating pork. In the Jewish book, First Maccabees, written around 100 BCE, there is an account of the Syrian king Antiochus Epiphanes rooting out Jewish people by making everybody eat pork, and hundreds of Jews refused and were put to death. In Fourth Maccabees, there's a hideous story of a mother with 7 grown sons, each of which in turn is tortured, is very barbaric, and put to death rather than eat pork. And the mother throughout it all cheers them on because, you know, they're doing the right thing. But in today's passage, Jesus says, don't you see that nothing that enters a person from the outside can defile them? For it doesn't go into their heart, but into their stomach and then out of the body. In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean. The conclusion that the author of Mark adds in is huge. All foods are clean. So what, these martyrs, they just died in vain? No wonder the Pharisees wanted to kill Jesus. He eats with sinners. He doesn't tell his disciples to fast or to practice ceremonial washing. He breaks the Sabbath, the rules around the Sabbath. He touches lepers. He touches a dead girl. He praises the faith of a bleeding, unclean woman who touches him. And now he's saying all foods are clean. None of those external rituals, it seems, even matter. They have built a fence around the Torah to keep out impurity, and they're working really hard to maintain and police that boundary. And Jesus says, you're wasting your time, because impurity, it's not out there, it's in here. It's within all of us, including you. Now, it seems that that last part about all foods being clean was not totally explicit. Mark refers to Jesus's words as a parable. But Jesus clearly expected at least some people to figure out what he was saying, at the very least his disciples, because when they don't, he says that great verse, are you so dull? I like the Message version of it. It says, are you being willfully stupid? Ouch. I bet that hurt. I actually had a math professor say just about the same to me. He said, Ruth, are you trying to impress me with your ignorance? That was 30 years ago and it still stinks. He was called Dr. Diath. It was death, but he had an apostrophe in there. And I kid you not, his office was next to an Asian math professor's office. And on the door, his surname was S-Y-N. So Dr. Sin and Dr. Death. I digress. So this was not a theological, abstract, polite debate. Emotions were running really high. The Pharisees had devoted their life to building that fence. And Jesus was willing to give his life, if that's what it took, to tear it down. And the disciples, as usual, seem to have not a clue what's going on. Now, Mark doesn't tell us what Jesus is feeling at this point, but I imagine Jesus must have been feeling pretty lonely, pretty frustrated and hurt and disappointed, perhaps even afraid that his mission is going to be a failure. Probably also concerned about physical safety and that of his disciples. You know, the Pharisees are getting really angry here, but there's other conflict. We were told in chapter 6 that John the Baptist had just been beheaded. And at this point in the narrative, Mark tells us that Jesus retreats from the area. He left Galilee, his Jewish home region, and traveled north to the historically hostile Gentile region of Tyre in the Roman province of Syria, which confusingly is in today's Lebanon, not Syria. I think we have a map of that. I cannot see that from here. So I think, yeah, Tyre's up here. They're going from the Sea of Galilee up to Tyre. Tyre was a region that had a lot of political and economic tension with Galilee. In the past, the people of Tyre had actually sold some of the Galileans into slavery. So, you know, that's not good. And even in Jesus's time, they were very economically oppressive. They were a rich city, and they would come and buy up pretty much all of the food that was grown by the poor Galilean farmers, leaving no food in the local market. So they were viewed as political enemies and economic oppressors to the Jewish people. But the rest of the chapter takes place in this region, and Andrew's going to read that to us now.
Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. Yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek, born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee and into the region of the Decapolis. There, some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak.
So Jesus was hiding out in the region of Tyre, maybe trying to let things cool off, maybe needing to refresh himself, his own spirit, spending time in prayer and relaxing, maybe deciding it was time to, really focus on teaching these disciples that were pretty clueless, definitely trying to escape the crowds and the Pharisees. He was also now in territory that was ruled directly by Rome, so he was no longer under the jurisdiction of the Jewish king, Herod Antipas, who had beheaded John. So physically, they were probably a little bit more safe too. And we have this story, which, as I mentioned previously, many scholars say mirrors the stories of Jairus' daughter and the hemorrhaging woman. Mark's wording suggests that this woman was ethnically Phoenician, but a Greek citizen. So she was probably, like Jairus, well-to-do, relatively. She had some degree of wealth. But in every other respect, she is the antithesis to Jairus. He was a devout Jewish man. He was a respected leader of the synagogue. She was a woman, a Gentile, a pagan. But like Jairus, she approached Jesus and she threw herself at his feet and begged him to heal her little daughter. Now, this was a culture that placed a great deal of emphasis on honor and shame. Jairus, as a Jewish male leader of the synagogue, gave honor to Jesus by falling at his feet. By his posture, he showed that he considered Jesus to be more honorable, more worthy of respect than he himself was. But the pagan foreign woman, by entering the house and throwing herself at Jesus' feet and begging him for help, literally using the words of a beggar, she brought shame both on herself and by association on Jesus. According to the rabbis, an honorable Jewish man would not even address his own wife in public, let alone a stranger and a foreigner. That fence around the law stipulated that Jesus now needed to send this woman away immediately and then detox from the impurity of her presence with ceremonial washing. She has polluted him and humiliated him, having the audacity to march into the house where he was staying and address him in this shameless way. The disciples were no doubt absolutely appalled with her. But of course, Jesus does not send her away with disgust. He engages her in conversation. What he says, though, seems at first reading at least to be really harsh. We read, "First, let the dogs eat all they want," he told her, "for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Did I read that right, or did I say dogs both times? Yeah, I suddenly thought, wait a minute. First, let the children eat all they want, for it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Jewish people at the time called themselves children and the Gentiles dogs, reflecting the animosity that they felt towards them. So this appears to be a racial slur. So what's going on? Is Jesus just having an off day? After all, he's trying to hide from people. He's emotionally drained. He's grieving the loss of his cousin. Was he just caught with his compassion down, as one commentator put it? It's possible, But personally, I don't think so. Mark has this conversation immediately after Jesus' teaching about what comes out of us reflects what's in our hearts. I think it would be strange then for him to portray Jesus as having something hateful coming out of him and something that would put this woman outside of the fence that he seems to be trying so hard to pull down. Rather, what it seems we have here is a challenge riposte, which New Testament scholar David de Silva defines as an attempt to gain honor at someone else's expense by publicly posing a challenge that cannot be answered. It's a trick question, in other words. And it's something that we see the Pharisees doing with Jesus all the time. They ask a question where, however you answer it, you're going to end up in trouble. So we see them asking him things like, should we pay taxes to Caesar? Now, if he says yes, the crowds are going to hate him. If he says no, there'll be trouble with the authorities. Or what do we do with this woman caught in adultery? Stone her to death. That's what the law says. Are we saying now that the law doesn't matter? There's no way of winning. But of course, Jesus had that wonderful way of coming up with another option that they hadn't seen. And instead of him being embarrassed and shamed in public, it kind of embarrasses the Pharisees. He turns it on its head. And here, Jesus engages this foreign woman who has supposedly shamed him, or shamed both of them by approaching him. And he honors her by engaging with her in conversation and provides her with an opportunity to regain her honor. Jesus draws on this well-known trope of children and dogs, but he softens it in two ways. First, instead of the usual word for dog, he uses the diminutive form. In other words, he says puppy dogs. And second, he says, let the children eat first. He doesn't deny that the puppies also need feeding. So he challenges her. Well, surely the children need to eat and be satisfied first, right? And the woman takes Jesus' lead. She rises to the challenge and she says, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Did Jesus see that coming? Mark doesn't tell us that. I suspect he did. But either way, he readily responds to her faith and he cedes the honor to her. He says, because of your reply, the demon has left your daughter. Not because of my graciousness, not because of my status, my power, but because of your reply. This builds on what we saw last week with Jesus being portrayed as empowering people, particularly his disciples, rather than merely stepping in and saving the day. He empowers them. Jesus gives the woman the credit. He restores her honor, her dignity. She's no longer a beggar at his feet. She is the agent through whom her daughter is healed. And then perhaps encouraged by the woman's faith, Jesus takes an extended trip around Gentile territory. Now, some commentators wonder whether Jesus learned from this woman that his mission needed to be more expansive than he'd originally realized. There's no way of knowing that, particularly from Mark's text alone. But Matthew's gospel tells this story a little differently and includes Jesus saying, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. And yet he goes from there to teach and heal in Gentile territory. So maybe it was like that. Maybe Jesus believed, as was standard belief at the time, that the Jewish Messiah would come, would restore Israel, and then Israel would be the shining light that would draw in all other nations. We don't know. I think for some of us, it can be a little uncomfortable, or it might even feel, almost sacrilegious to kind of think that Jesus has got to learn. But actually, we know he had to learn, right? He had to learn everything. He was born as a baby. He must have been taught everything he knew. And like all of us, maybe he had to unlearn some things that he had been taught. In addition, according to Mark, at this stage, Jesus has only once before interacted with Gentiles. You remember that that was one of the stories for last week, which we just looked at briefly. But Jesus sailed across the Sea of Galilee to Decapolis, Gentile territory, where he was met with a man who was possessed by a legion of impure spirits. And although we didn't look at that story in detail, you might remember that Jesus, in curing him, drives out these spirits. They go into a herd of pigs. The herd of pigs rushes down a steep incline and are drowned in the sea. And the people of the town, maybe out of fear, maybe out of anger at the economic loss, they tell Jesus to go away. They plead with him to leave the region. They want nothing to do with him. And of course, he does. He leaves. And in the following chapter, in chapter 6, Jesus sent out the disciples into the villages to teach. And he tells them this: if any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. So it would be understandable if Jesus didn't expect the surrounding areas to be ready to receive the message of the kingdom of God here in Gentile territory, and was therefore avoiding teaching and healing in those areas. But this woman showed him that at least some of them were ready. At least some of them recognized that Jesus had something they needed. He had metaphorical food. He had bread that they were hungry for. In contrast to the Pharisees in Galilee, who are scandalized at Jesus's approach to literal food, and unlike the disciples who just don't seem to get it, willfully stupid, she, a pagan woman, apparently got it. She rejected this idea that Gentiles are outside of the fence. She said, no, we're right here. We're under the table, and we're ready for whatever you can spare. Give us the crumbs. Give us the scraps. We are hungry too. We need feeding too. And so we read that Jesus traveled up to Sidon. I think we've got the map again. So travels up to Sidon and then back around this way onto the far side of the Sea of Galilee to Decapolis, which is the area that he had previously been asked to leave. And Mark tells us that the man who had been healed by Jesus, the man from whom Jesus had driven out these impure spirits, went around telling all the people about what had happened, and they were amazed. So presumably as a result of the man's story, people knew who Jesus was and knew that he had this power to heal, because when he arrived, they brought him people who were sick and he healed them, including a man whose ears were stopped and his tongue tied. And this particular healing story seems to be very rich in symbolism. Jesus opens the man's ears and enables him to speak freely. And he does so by using saliva. Now, saliva was reputed to have healing powers in Greek society, but was an unclean substance in Jewish culture. Jesus again tears down that fence. He becomes ceremonially unclean in spitting and in putting his fingers in the man's ears and in touching his tongue. And Jesus calls out, Ephatha, open up. This healing seems to be representative of what is actually happening throughout this region. People are opening up. They are hearing, they are understanding, and they are spreading the good news. And then we come to our third and final story for today, Mark's last story in Gentile territory, which again, Andrew's going to read for us.
During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. After he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha.
So this story is obviously very similar to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. There are some noticeable differences in the details. There are a different number of people and bread and baskets left over. And there's probably some symbolism in that. But I think that the thing that really ties all these stories together is this idea of taking bread, eating, and being satisfied. In the story of the feeding of the 5,000 in Jewish territory, Jesus took the bread, gave it to the people, they ate and were satisfied. They were full. They had big laundry hamper-sized baskets full of leftovers. Then in the story of the Syrophoenician woman, Jesus says that the children, the Jewish people, need to be satisfied first, and that it's not right to take the bread and give it to the dogs. But the woman says even the puppies get to eat the children's crumbs. And then in the feeding of the 4,000, again in Gentile territory, Jesus took the bread, the people ate, and again, they were satisfied and they had these big laundry hamper-sized baskets full of leftovers. The Syrophoenician woman seems to be the turning point. And now what was happening among Jews is happening among the Gentiles. In the course of a chapter and a half, Mark has portrayed Jesus as shifting from a Jewish rabbi whose disciples don't all ceremonially wash their hands before eating, to someone who hosts a dinner party for 4,000 unclean enemy oppressors of Israel. That's quite a transformation. Any sort of a barrier between Jew and Gentile in the eyes of Jesus is now completely removed at this point in the story. The fence is gone. The stakes in this conflict now have been raised. The tension, the conflict with the Pharisees, the Jewish religious leaders, is at an all-time high. Well, okay, that's kind of moved the story along, but what are we to learn from this? How does any of this apply to us? Well, there are 4 questions that I would like to leave us with for us to think about during the time of response, which we'll have in just a few moments. If the band want to start making their way back up, that would be good. But to think about during this coming time of response, but also to think about during the week and to reflect on. And as usual, we do have discussion questions or questions to use yourself to think through some of these issues a little bit more. But the 4 questions are these. First, what's in our hearts? Are we clean on the inside, or are we hypocrites too? We don't ever want to think we're like the Pharisees, right? They're the bad guys. But actually, of course, they were the religious folk of the day. People who were supposedly trying to obey God's law, and yet what came out of them was so often ugly and selfish. They thought they were better than everyone else. Do we? Sometimes. A little bit secretly. They thought that God owed them, that they were special to God in a way that pagans and sinners were not. Do we think that sometimes? What comes out of us when people catch us on a bad day, when we're tired, when we're feeling undervalued or unloved? What insecurities come rushing out of us? Could God say of us, they honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me? Second, are we like the Pharisees building fences? Are we thinking that the problems they're not with us, but they're with them, whoever them is in our minds? Or are we like Jesus, dedicated to tearing the fences down? Do we recognize that we're all in this together? We're all a bit messed up on the inside, but we're all loved. We're all included. Every one of us is equally precious to God, even our oppressors, even the enemy. Even those people we find annoying. No one was unclean to Jesus. No one was excluded. No one was lesser than or on the other side of the fence. Do we see people that same way? Third, are we open to being challenged? If Jesus was open to learning and being challenged and having his horizons expanded, are we? Are we open to God speaking to us through the voices of others, through people who are not like us? Are we teachable? What might God be saying to us today? How might we need to step out of our comfort zone to bring hope and healing to others? And then finally, are we satisfied? Mark is saying throughout these chapters that there is enough for everyone to be satisfied, that we can eat this metaphorical bread that Jesus brings and be full. Do we feel full? In part of today's passage that we didn't read, the Pharisees asked for a sign. Even though Jesus has healed the sick and raised the dead, it wasn't enough. Their eyes were willfully closed to the wonderful things that Jesus was doing. They couldn't see it. They had stopped their ears and hardened their hearts. Meanwhile, the Gentile crowd followed after Jesus. They brought their sick to him, and he enabled them to open up and to receive what he had for them. They listened to his teaching for days on end until they were in danger of fainting from hunger. And still they didn't leave. And Jesus gave them bread. They ate and were satisfied. Do some of us perhaps long for more of Jesus, long for our hearts to be softened, long to be fed by the words and presence of Jesus? During this time of response, let's tell that to Jesus. Let's open our hearts to receive from him. In a moment, we're going to take communion. You can light a candle, you can write out a prayer, all the usual ways that we have to respond, and they're described on the first page of the flyer if you're unfamiliar with those. But first, let's have a moment of quiet just to open our hearts to whatever God might be saying to us today. So maybe we can turn the lights down just a little bit. Let's leave that on the screen. And let's just take a moment to be with God. We want to be more like you, Jesus. Soften our hearts. Open our ears. Empower us. Make us loving like you.